双节激动做就了，上去把这大能加上去，大个制作几百次。到了半夜的我生前堂前，电话筒电源接到电话的姐姐，电话筒电话机接到找我，电话没被电话的马桶门找我去，你的交通你多找位到乡去，你把这了姐姐说也没多，这让你你的这马路说姐姐呢没得包。那个人拿着拿着包了就三千两千三百，我一下来就到了，这就这么的，去就过了，过到说那么多感觉什么的，那么生气，到三千多钱，老七十多万钱也拿的。去那阵子我这里那都说那吃饭吃饭这里那都成都也些事吃饭这里那都说那么多感觉我这那么是大多三千大几我70多万这里那都去那阵子我这里那都说那吃饭吃饭这里那都成都也些事吃饭这里那都说那么多感觉我这那么是大多三千大几老70多万这里那都去那阵子我这里那都说那吃饭吃饭这里那都成都也些事吃饭现在那都说我那搞到也没时间他去那他们把要到把这边送去就搞好的不能想，对，觉得他们去上网上的同样是，也把它做完了没？这些上网上到的300人就，对呢，等他那个感受，对呢，老生就老，对呢，俺们啥套是没得不的，家干的有呢，各把都对没，全部帮忙么怎么？他把的带了100，那么这么按呢，但是从嘛，这个东部去了，好久去，然后兄啊，这个这工了老师，但是在呢，他是白个也不去看，去那是也不，这个去看公看着不，这个去也不都看着不都，也是下来拍到看着不，在这里。但是从嘛，就是白上他觉得咱呢，去好像下去也不得，下那个干嘛怎么做，干这就不休息。
Rinpoche says, in general, I would like to express how happy I am to be able to come on this occasion to Los Angeles, particularly since I had to come from such a long distance from India. The fact that I've been able to come and arrive safely and meet with all of you gives me a great deal of joy. To meet with all of you in the audience, you men and women who, through your interest and sincerity in following the spiritual path, are experiencing the great good fortune of these teachings. In particular, I would like to welcome the lamas and the monks and nuns who are present as the members of the ordained Sangha among us, many of whom have undertaken the monastic ordination as a sign of their sincere commitment to the teachings. They have taken part, many of them, in the traditional 3-month retreat program, which is a training ground both for one's own practice and for the abilities, the capabilities to benefit others through teaching. These individuals have also trained in the Tibetan language in order to be able to access the teachings of Dharma in the original scriptures and thus improve their understanding. This is something that benefits not only the individual who studies and practices in this way, but it also renders them more able to benefit others. And the fact that so many of us can come together in these very auspicious circumstances gives me a feeling of great joy, and I wish to express that to you this evening.
tene sanche sagayares, sanche je kola yo, tene nyawa yedo tendo saga sum, hadu mazo hava is torika nasu de, roa ritu nasu tata yares, tene one, tene garuso, torika lete, tomoda bate, mai lete sare, tene lete saroga yapores, yapon one, tene torika lete inayo, tele shawa kane, saraju tsudo, kachu tsudo, rebaye miko oki, chila kakhe takedo, chika nasa kayam shepado, ila chika samame patare mamboya bares, tino ne tere, charoso tsuma, chila, te ka, rojichi, shawa kane lazumbo sete, tene chila lojundo, o chila supa shivate, tene sharawa lite sombo, Kalu Rinpoche Bardo, Pena, Gitende Kos Garoso, Serton, Deri Matiton, Doja Pana, Casal Rinpoche, Rizon Chembo, Terrabo Yinza, Meli Rinpoche, the Cheroso Tabata, Charaga Cabazomores.
There is the state of an awakened, enlightened being, which we might term Buddhahood, and that of an unenlightened, unawakened being, a sentient being, an ordinary sentient being. And if we're perfectly honest with ourselves, we realize, most of us, that we fall into the second category. That if we're going to be classified anywhere in these two categories, it's going to be as a sentient being. And what that implies is that our minds are currently under the influence of and experience things in terms of a dualistic and discursive mode of consciousness. There's a continual subject-object differentiation in the way we perceive the world around us, which causes our minds to entertain discursive thought patterns. And this is what we would term a sentient being. According to the Buddhist teachings, there are 6 different possibilities of rebirth within this cycle of samsara, the cycle of conditioned existence that is experienced by sentient beings. 3 of these are lower states of rebirth, in the hells, in the realm of the pretas or hungry ghosts, and in the animal realm. And 3 of these are, relatively speaking, superior or higher realms of rebirth, in that they are more fortunate states. The human realm, the realm of demigods, and the realm of gods, the gods of the cycle of rebirth. These constitute the 6 categories, the 6 realms of being. We, of course, have attained in this human rebirth a relatively fortunate state of rebirth. It is fortunate because it provides a useful working basis for spiritual development. The fact that we have come by this human state of rebirth is not something that happens haphazardly or at random. It is due to merit and virtue reinforced in previous existences, combined with our own aspirations and a connection that we have established in the past with the 3 jewels, with the sources of refuge. And this is what accounts for us attaining this favorable state of rebirth in this life. It also accounts for the fact that we feel naturally inclined. We feel a natural faith. We feel a natural inclination or interest in the teachings of Buddhism. The fact that some of us automatically feel this kind of faith and joy in a spiritual tradition is an indication of these previous karmic connections. And to use this human existence well, to receive further teachings, to receive empowerments, and to put these transmissions into practice, all of this means that what might have been an ordinary human rebirth has become a precious human existence. And the term precious here is used in the way it is used to describe, for example, something like gold or pearls or diamonds in this world, things that we value, that we consider rare, precious, difficult to come by, and very, very useful when they are acquired. In the same way, the precious human existence is that very fortunate state where the potential of the human being is realized through spiritual practice.
Pena Matago Colotaba, Cone Sia Lematella Coasaris, then Coatella Dunha Momboyaris, the Kayaris and Yala Zochi Kitaro Yedola Tekonga, Tolola Mo Corsi La Supa, Gila Savetunga Yoris, then Mala, ngaros mala se to ga gepe to ga nai to ga che to ya to ga chimo je yo des sama ina chodo to jedo ke taje ke to ga yo des sala de da to ga munde de na che photo to ga chimo yo des taja za ko to ga ja cha ta des tele do ha tele tawa se pe na de taba sonje jo compose ze yo des.
This then is the situation of a sentient being, an unenlightened being, that there is a continual wandering of the mind in rebirth after rebirth in the cycle we know technically as samsara. And this process is fueled by the actions that are committed by an individual being. When these actions are of a positive nature, then the karma which is generated by these actions contributes through a process of causality to the attainment and the experience of higher states of rebirth, relatively speaking, with greater degrees of freedom, greater degrees of happiness and satisfaction. When the activities, the actions of that being are of a largely negative and harmful nature, then this negative karmic patterning contributes through a process of causality to rebirth in the three relatively lower realms. But the mind is never completely free from any of these alternatives. It is always wandering from one to another of these in a vicious circle. And because there is this cyclic nature, because it moves around just like the wheel of a car, moving around and around and around again with no escape, no break, no interruption, it is termed in Sanskrit samsara, in Tibetan korwa, which simply means the turning, or the wheel, the cycle. And this whole process involves a great deal of suffering, though that suffering differs from one realm to the other. In the realms of the hell beings, the suffering is largely due to the intense heat and cold to which these beings are subjected in their environment. In the realm of the pretas, or hungry ghosts, the suffering is largely due to hunger and thirst and exposure to the elements. In the realm of animals, the affliction is due in part to the struggle for survival, the chain of life where there is one species continually predating on another species, and also due to the activities of human beings in domesticating these animals and bending them to their service and to their will and misusing them and ill-treating them. Among human beings, as we are quite aware, there are many sufferings, perhaps the major ones being those of birth, the pain of the birth process, the pain of the aging process, the pain of sickness and disease, and finally the pain of death. Among demigods, the suffering is largely due to the jealousy and envy in their minds, which gives rise to the quarrel and strife among these beings. And although such overt forms of suffering may not be present in the experience of devas, or the gods of samsara, there is an all-pervasive suffering which eventually results in their falling into a much lower state of rebirth and experiencing the agonies of this. And when we examine the alternatives within the cycle of rebirth in this way, we see that it truly is, as the teachings tell us, an ocean of suffering, a vast ocean from which there is an automatic, a very natural inclination for the individual to want to be freed, to want to transcend. And this is this state of transcendence, this state of release from this ocean of suffering is what we might term Buddhahood, awakened enlightenment. In pursuing this goal of release, liberation from the cycle of rebirth, there are a number of different approaches which can be employed. There is the so-called Hinayana approach of the Shravakas, of those who hear and practice the teachings on this level, those who attain the realization of an Arhat or a Pratyeka Buddha, a so-called self-made Buddha. There are those who may follow the Mahayana path of the Bodhisattva and traverse the 10 bhumis, the 10 levels of Bodhisattva realization, from the first to the 10th, and thus progress to full enlightenment. There are many different approaches, in short, all of which lead eventually toward the same goal. They may all be considered true paths towards liberation, towards awakened enlightenment, because they all ultimately aim toward the same goal. which is to say they aim towards the release of the individual from the cycle of rebirth. And so the different approaches towards the awakened state of enlightenment, which constitutes this release or liberation, are sometimes classified as the 3 yanas, sometimes classified as the 9 yanas, and there are any number of schemata for delineating these vehicles, up to and including an infinity of approaches. But it is useful enough for our purposes to consider these approaches to fall into 2 categories, the lesser and the greater vehicle. Speaking very, very broadly and simply, we can classify the approaches of the Buddhist path into those of the Hinayana and those of the Mahayana. And within the Mahayana, the greater vehicle of Mahayana, we can distinguish that there is a dialectic approach, a causal vehicle, which employs methods as causes leading to eventual results, which is known as the vehicle of the paramitas, of the perfections. And then there is the secret mantra path of the Vajrayana, in which the goal is an ever-present possibility, a much more rapid path. The particular empowerment that we are concerned with this evening and over the next 2 days is an empowerment into the mandala of the peaceful and wrathful deities of the Bardo, or after-death state. And it is part of the cycle of the so-called Bardo Tudral, or as it is commonly referred to in English, the Tibetan Book of the Dead. Constituting as it does a major empowerment into the mandalas of these deities, this empowerment partakes of the approach which is the pinnacle, which is the very pinnacle of all of these, that is to say, the secret mantra path of Vajrayana. In this particular fortunate kalpa, or age in which we live, there have appeared and will appear a total of 1,000 Buddhas, fully enlightened beings. The Buddha Shakyamuni, who appeared in the country of India some 2,500 years ago, was the 4th of these guides that will eventually appear during this age. And by demonstrating the 12 great deeds of a fully enlightened Buddha and appearing and teaching in the country of India so many years ago, the Buddha Shakyamuni established a legacy of teachings that was truly vast and profound in its implications. He taught from both the approach of both the Sutra tradition, the exoteric tradition of Buddhism, and the more esoteric tantric approach of Vajrayana. He taught the Hinayana, the Mahayana, and the Vajrayana in such a complete way, and these teachings spread so widely that the number of people who became, over the generations, learned, learned and accomplished and realized in these teachings was truly as numerous, these beings were truly as numerous as the stars in the nighttime sky. And from this Indian tradition of Buddhism, there occurred a historical transmission of the teachings to the land of snows, the country to the north of India, which we know as Tibet. Now, originally, Tibet was an extremely backward and uncivilized place. It was regarded by most of the civilized world as a land of demons. And the status, the level to which the Tibetan people had progressed was very, very rudimentary. There was not even a coherent system of government or of organization of the Tibetan peoples, but rather they lived in anarchistic tribal units scattered across the valleys of Central Asia. It was only when emanations of Buddhas and Bodhisattvas appeared among them as rulers and leaders over generations, beginning to organize and bring together the Tibetan people as a nation. It was only at that point that, due to the further activity of such emanations of great Buddhas and Bodhisattvas, that the teachings of Buddhism were able to be transmitted, transplanted from their Indian home to this country of Tibet. And so gradually over the centuries there was this process of assimilation where the Buddhist teachings gradually began to move across the Himalayas to the land of snows.
자가네 소도 치몽바죠 하바도 시르즈가 도주년 시장가 나서파 배를 실때 시르즈가 거네 로데 나카도냐 맞제 대마스 자네 자자 꼰조 바 네팔이 바이네 바자 투츠 카스지 대진지 관람 그냥 사사가 저 이기는 거 찾자면도 저 뭐시도 이 대초대 근데 담에 치죠 소아레스.
In particular, it was during the reign of the Tibetan king known as Songtsen Gampo, who is regarded historically as having been the actual presence of the Bodhisattva of compassion, Avalokiteshvara, appearing among the Tibetan people. It was during the reign of this king that the final consolidation of the Tibetan Empire took place, and all of the tribes and peoples of the area we now know as Tibet were brought together under a single rule, as a single nation. It was also during the reign of this king, Songtsen Gampo, that the first formal introduction of Buddhism into Tibet took place. In particular, this king was responsible for the bringing to Tibet from India of many different scriptures associated with Buddhism, particularly with the practice and teachings surrounding the Bodhisattva of compassion, Avalokiteshvara, and the translation of these texts into the Tibetan language. And due to this activity, the king began the process of introducing and assimilating the Buddhist teachings into his home culture. As well, he married a princess of the Chinese court and a princess of the Nepalese court, and when these two queens were brought from their homelands to Tibet, they brought with them tangible signs of their own culture's faith in the Buddhist teachings. In particular, they brought to Tibet two of the holiest statues of the Buddha, one of which is known as Joel Rinpoche, or the Precious Lord, and the other of which is known as Joel Michidorje, the Lord who is the unshakable Vajra. And these two statues were brought to Tibet and installed in cathedrals in Lhasa. And this is considered historically by the Tibetan people to be the date of the formal introduction of the Buddhist teachings to their culture, that taking place during the reign of King Songtsen Gampo.
치지 잡아서 좀 들어와 인사 자간에 그뭐 모두 사도도 후배 빼만 주네 대나가 그좀 뭐시야 존에 별 되네 소제지 때마다 와서 되네 후배 빼만 주네 그나면 엄마 자만야 시장아 예배터서 자실라서 버세테 소하 쇼도 나가니 하바도 소하 때마다 니마 차와진다 별 전에 저마다 봐도 크버츠 Tela Chita, Sunjak Dama, Hemata, Zuriaris, that's it, Hemata, Ibas Yaris, that's it, so Ima Pass and Pel Chiju, the mother of Teshuaris, Hemata.
In succeeding generations, the Tibetan kings continued this work of assimilation, and in particular, 2 or 3 generations following Songtsen Gampo, his descendant, a king whose name was Trisung Detsen, and who again is regarded historically as an emanation of a great bodhisattva. King Trisung Detsen was responsible for inviting to Tibet from India great figures of the Indian Buddhist tradition, in particular an abbot whose name was Shanti Rakshita, and a great tantric master whose name was Padmasambhava. And along with many other teachers who were invited to Tibet under the auspices of King Trisung Detsen's government, the teachings of Buddhism flourished even more widely. In particular, Padmasambhava was responsible for teaching directly to Trisung Detsen, King Trisung Detsen, and his ministers and subjects, teaching presenting the teachings of the Vajrayana. There were a group of 25 members of the court who were personal students of Padmasambhava, as well as many other members of the Tibetan populace who studied this path. And so in general, during the reign of Trisung Detsen in the 8th century, the teachings of the Sutra tradition and Tantra tradition spread even more widely in Tibet. In particular, it was the teachings of Vajrayana that captured the imagination of the Tibetan people, such that the tradition of Vajrayana, of Tantric Buddhism, began to shine like the sun throughout the Tibetan region, and the number of people who gained realization and understanding through these teachings were again as numerous as the stars in the sky. Those of you who are familiar with the term Nyingma as one of the schools of Tibetan Buddhism might be interested to know that this term literally means the ancient or the old school, and it dates from these early origins of Buddhism in Tibet, because this is the earliest historical school that can be determined in Tibet itself. It is known as the Nyingma, or ancient school.
Kanga mambo kone lots of mama tone George Pade Atishatala Atishala Super Kibato Travato Pisebo Mambo Pel Dentro Penayum you Shojis and Richard Shara Chimbo Zenny Chimbotene Mambo Jagala Tone Vijay Tame lots of Tutroto lots of Jajit lots of Chimbotas Penavo lots of Mamashuna Tenipella Chi Yonsu to Padahari Nenzo Chipata Jichimushoris, Tita Jichuashate, Chichilla Tene, Gaji Sacha, Kelly, Jono Chumba, Lasupa, Dichita Day, Tamashua, Hemasoha, Niaga, Dichita Jessica, Pel Tasore, Ta Hemata Soha Nimachu, Tejela Tawate. And
flourish among the Tibetan people over following centuries. There is an old proverb to the effect that for that which is precious and valuable, there are always many obstacles. There are always many damage or impair this thing. And such was the case historically in Tibet. There were many setbacks, there were many persecutions and attempts to overthrow the Buddhist teachings among the Tibetan people. But ultimately, these proved fruitless. At a certain point in history, during the 11th century, a Tibetan king in the south of Tibet, whose name was Hla Lama Changchub-e, his name literally means the light of enlightenment, became concerned at what he saw not only as obstacles to the teachings in the Tibetan cultural situation, but also as what he perceived as signs of degeneration and corruption in the teachings themselves. And he felt it was very important to revivify these teachings by inviting again great masters from India to come and teach. And it was under his auspices that many great scholars and teachers of Indian Buddhism, in particular the great Atisha of India, were invited to Tibet. As well, it was at this time that many Tibetans who proved themselves very wise, of great intelligence and great diligence in industry, were sent to India in order to learn the indigenous languages there so that they could become translators and translate the teachings accurately from Sanskrit and other Indian languages into their own native Tibetan language. And due to the activity of these many hundreds of translators who were trained, the teachings again began to spread widely in a revivified and purified form. And from that time in the 11th century that this new school of translation was instituted, some 7 distinct lineages grew up. And these are known to us today as the Kargyupa school, the Sakyapa school, the Gelugpa school, the Jonangpa school, the Shangpa school, and so forth. There are in fact 7 of these in total. And these, taken together with the earlier or ancient tradition of the Nyingma, are sometimes referred to as the 8 great practice lineages of Tibet. And in addition, another distinction which is sometimes made historically is between the Nyingma school as the sole surviving legacy from the early spread of Buddhism in the 8th century, taking that as the Nyingma, as the ancient tradition, and taking all of the other 7 that developed from the 11th century onwards as the so-called Sarma, or new schools. And so you will very often see reference in Tibetan texts to Sar Nying, that is to say, new and old, the new lineages, the more recent lineages, and the older or more ancient lineage. Now, it might seem, if we look at the surface of things, that these are distinct or separate lineages that are very different from one another. These so-called 8 lineages, for example, in the Tibetan tradition of Buddhism. But if we examine things on a more inner or profound level, we realize that all of these are the same in that they present, each and every one of them, a specific and complete path for a given individual to attain awakened enlightenment, to attain the level of Buddhahood. In that respect, all of these schools are identical, though they may differ in their specific methods and their specific means of presentation. The transmission with which we are concerned this weekend, which is part and parcel of the so-called Bardo Tudrol, or Tibetan Book of the Dead cycle, these are an example of these kinds of teachings which exist in each and every one of these lineages that can provide the opportunity for a given individual to attain Buddhahood. The teachings of Buddhism, when taken together, are extremely vast and extremely profound and present a wealth of techniques, a wealth of different approaches. Some of these are more suited, more adapted to those who lead very busy and complex lives and have very little time or energy to devote to formal religious practice. And this is the reason why you will often find these practices referred to in the Tibetan tradition as Tongdrol, which simply means liberation through seeing, or Tudrol, liberation through hearing. That mere contact with these teachings carries with it a powerful blessing that can be a very effective impetus to the spiritual development of the individual.
Bardo nas Jack Yoris, Yena, Bardo Nasala, Bardo, Chebo, Ijato, Trudo, then young Bardo, Trom Naparabo, then it's a Yoris, Nas Mamba Yoris, the Sotan Japa, the second dog about it, Yena, Dot Department of China, Bardo Secretary, Pena Radiana, Radico Padella, Bardo Sagayoris. Tell about him at the Germanic Sandabola, Padosa Yoris, Telefana, Marosina, Tomba Aman, Shena, Shishama de Pate, Sashi Padosa Yoris, Nikuna, Niku Tavato, Nis Massa Pato, Mala Padosa Yoris, then Maros Chene, Tene, then Chatsa, Maso Pato, Shashi Padosa Yoris. Then Chene Tremet Jadroyoris, Tremet Javate, Tremamani Padolo, Chini Padas Yoris, Then you Trebent one Sagaris, 집에 보면 나서봐 다 가서 세나 나도 거에 버튼을 타면 반찬네 되네 예리도 가서 되나 쉬었지만 람베 카텔라 되네 스파파도스 그래서 되네 스파파도네 앞에는 가로서 따라이나 마이 나디시와라스나 세 마세죠 받들어 되네 셀레 받았어 그래서 되네 셀찬 마시지 받을 거의 좀 코로를 하다 받을 지하라고 나서 들리지레스
One of the fundamental concepts contained within this cycle of teachings is that which is known in Tibetan as Bardo, or what we might translate as an intermediate state, an interval. And this concept of Bardo is discussed from any number of different points of view. You sometimes find reference in the teachings to the 4 great Bardos or interval states, or the 5 great Bardos, or the 6 great Bardos, or even an infinite number of interval states. There are many different ways of looking at this particular aspect of our experience. And a great deal of time, which we don't happen to have, could be spent discussing this concept in excruciating detail. But we can look at it from a very rough overview. Let's take this term Bardo in Tibetan. Par meaning interval and do meaning two, between two. The idea of an interval or space between two things or two events. In terms of physical space, we could look at the space between two mountaintops and say that that was a Bardo, that that was an interval or an intermediate space. But the kind of Bardo that we are talking about here is more one of psychology and experience. For example, the interval between our previous lifetime and our future lifetime, that is to say this lifetime, can be regarded from this point of view as a Bardo state, as an intermediate or interval state. Now, from the time that we are conceived in our mother's womb to the time that we eventually die in this lifetime, this constitutes one major Bardo, or one major interval in our experience, the Bardo of birth and death, from the moment of conception to the moment that we die. We experience a different kind of Bardo when we go to sleep at night and experience the dream state, the Bardo of the dream state, which lasts as long as we are asleep, from the time we go to sleep to the time that we wake up in the morning. So within the greater context of the Bardo between life and death, between birth and death, there is a second kind of Bardo, a second kind of interval or intermediate state which is associated with dream. At the point in this lifetime that we actually come to die, the process of dying as our mind-body complex gradually disintegrates is a third kind of Bardo, which is known as the Bardo of the time of death. Following our death, there is, by and large, for the vast majority of beings, a period of unconsciousness. And following this period of unconsciousness, the first glimmerings of a returning consciousness in a disembodied state after death. And this particular interval of unconsciousness and the slow stirrings of returning consciousness is known as the Bardo of Dharmata, the Bardo of the fundamental nature of reality. And following this, there is a period of time which is indefinite in length, during which the mind experiences all kinds of confused hallucinations and projections, which go on endlessly, until such time as the individual karma of that being, of that consciousness, propels it into a future state of rebirth. For example, in the case of a being being reborn as a human, it would be up until the point that the mind is implanted in the mother's womb during the process of conception. And that interval during which the mind experiences these chaotic and often very terrifying and frightening hallucinations, this is known as the Bardo of becoming. And it lasts up until the time that the being actually takes rebirth in a physical form again. And so we can see that these different states of Bardo or interval state are simply another way of describing the cycle of rebirth, because there is a continuity, moving from one state of Bardo to the other, always experiencing one or the other of these kinds of Bardo, these kinds of intervals or intermediate states.
알아서 서서 라발이야레스 네 가서 탈라발라 데 시어디 제라 가서 탈라발라 드벨라디파 소나 다타서 터여야레 대셔서 게디니까 서 트베가티리테 첨버진자 셔시바도 데라티니 디파포 게아주 치용도 빠지 나스라 트바데 셔라네 첨버게 첨버도 버지레스 데네 셔시바도 사케테 페나 사마르 버도 버지레스 사마 림보제나 데네 파 쳇파갈 레터그레스 가바자도는 또 생각그레스 이나 고타용 덴치 파칼레터그레스 다다가 알아서 또뭐 데네 시안에 버거 치슈레스 데네 rimbe yapagate char dalpa dene lojona so paso yares dene tata taso yandone dene dalpa pate hanam game again can sound of la tsores tati sina samati shakala bola sina sunni double chale desya zatere samati pakal lenjibana tashiris desya zatere ngarus sasi padar sane 데네 제가 받을 말을 참여를 요하를 데네 받을 게 체질이라고 지는 다다르스
We are, of course, according to this schema, we are currently experiencing in our waking state at this moment the bardo between birth and death. And from the point of view of these teachings, this is the most significant bardo state that we ever experience, precisely because it carries with it a great deal of power. The actions that one commits as a conscious being, particularly as a human being with that favorable working basis for spiritual development, the acts that one commits within that bardo or that interval state carry the most weight. We are, in a sense, on a pivotal point. If we choose to progress upwards to higher states of rebirth, or ideally to practice purely the teachings of Dharma, the actions that we direct towards those goals in this waking state between birth and death carry the most weight, far more than any that we might undertake in other pardo or intermediate states. We have the potential as human beings to attain the full awakened enlightenment of Buddhahood in this very life, in this very body, as did someone such as the Venerable Milarepa. That is in the palm of our hands right now. But if we choose to waste or misuse that opportunity and to ensure that our mind will plunge into very negative and low states of rebirth, we also have the potential to do that, because what we commit in this lifetime carries with it great karmic weight, great consequences. It is because of the power, because of the force or strength of our actions in this life, on a karmic level, that this bardo, this interval, is the most crucial, is the most powerful state, and is the most important one to which to direct our attentions. We are, as it were, on a bridge. We might think of this lifetime between birth and death as a bridge that we are traveling. It may be a very long bridge, but then again we may travel by car and arrive very quickly at the end of the bridge. Or we may walk and arrive very slowly at the end of that bridge. But sooner or later, all of us are going to arrive at the end of that bridge. We have no choice but to keep walking along that bridge. When we were born, as very, very small infants, we began to grow, we began to age immediately. We began to move towards the end of that bridge, slowly but surely. We grew up to adolescence and became young adults, young men and women. We went to school, we learned trades or professions, we began to establish our lives. And we, most of us perhaps, find that we're now at middle age. We're kind of on the borderline where we wouldn't quite say we were old, but we wouldn't quite say we were young. We're getting on that bridge further and further. Some of us might feel we're halfway there, some of us might feel we're 2/3 of the way there. But all of us know we're going to arrive at the end of that bridge sooner or later. It is guaranteed. No matter how long it takes or how short a time it takes, the one guarantee we have is that we are walking on that bridge and we are going to arrive at the end of that bridge, which is to say, we are going to have to face the bardo of dying. That is something we are all very sure of, if we think about it.
깨지고 조져요 그래서 맞아 조사나 이때 내가 나서 정말 말아서 뭐지니는 세스만다고 타지 뒤지는 전에 랑가 세집부터 깨지니가 제스 존에 랑가 요아리 대깔들이 오메 바디스 제세 랑 깨지줘야 말이 라게티고 온 랑가야를 대세자 다다스는 여림보지 또나 저러 개체먹 되지래서 대세자들이 다 맛있은 질 지켜하더니 라드시나 롱가 생라 롱터바 대다 마주나 다게 레마 있어 겨들이 지서 디판들이 보소 마시아지마 데 가슴 만드는 토리도 타벨랑 들을 터지래서 로데와다부 텐소나 들 라드지 받아보려네 대다부 나스도 저러 개체뭐 단체지 틀을 여기 빠지래서
Now, in this interval between birth and death, those of us who attain rebirth in this human realm tend to treat the world around us as something permanent, as something solid and real, something ultimately there, something extremely important, and somehow something that determines ultimately our happiness and well-being. And so we devote so much of our time and our effort and our attention in this life to defending ourselves against enemies and consolidating ourselves with friends and establishing some kind of position in this world with all of this effort in the misguided hope that here is something solid, eternal, definite that we can rely upon. And at a certain point that is no longer the case. We come to the end of our lives, inevitably, and it's just like waking up from a dream. And even if it was a good dream, we woke up from the dream, and everything just has to be laid down at that point. Everything that we invested with all of that solidity and all of that importance no longer matters. And then we become a sentient being in the bardo. Our mind, disembodied, wanders in the after-death state, where there is absolutely no control, absolutely no ability to determine or manipulate our environment. We are entirely subject in a very helpless and terrifying way to the projections of our karma. And so, if we think about it in a more long-term way, what becomes truly important is not simply what we can acquire and consolidate in this life on a mundane level, but what kind of spiritual development we can make in preparation not only for this life, but for the future. Ideally, we can aspire to attain full and complete control and realization of our own minds, and transcend this cycle of rebirth once and for all. But at the very least, we can live our lives in such a way that we accentuate in ourselves and others that which is virtuous and positive, that we eliminate and diminish the effect of that which is negative and harmful, and so that we can approach our death with a cheerful frame of mind, so that we can die with an easy mind, realizing that we have laid a good foundation for the future, and that our mind will not fall into a state of greater suffering and greater ignorance and confusion, but will attain to a higher state from which we can continue our spiritual development. This is something Rinpoche says that I want all of you to think about very deeply, please, because it is a very crucial issue.
또도 와서 저런시 걸어서가 커트거든요. 대단히 연에 걸어 집으셔도도 되는 알아서 토트가 요리스. 대단히 되는 알아서 저런시 용 매나 타나 받아보지 또 저는 저거를 주우레스. 아주 힘을 쫓으면 기쁘다요 말이 맞나고 되는 또 사지도 대사지 잘 간바지야나 마셔 저 대리 대근디 사리 라라버더스 대세자 저 치시 다단을 하시잖아요. 로로 야손도 만들어내 터리글라는 준비 소재지 컴포터도 바지 저렇게 쳐버렸어. 대 사시 받아가 랑가 체시라고 때렸어.
And so, if we look at this objectively, while we see that in this world there are many people who attempt to gain power and wealth and fame and great enjoyment, luxury, and so forth, we can also appreciate the fact that none of us escape death, that everyone eventually dies. And we can really, looking at it scientifically, so to speak, we can see, does any of this wealth, does any of this power, does any of this influence ultimately benefit the individual? When we see someone who is wealthy, who dies, did that wealth eventually, ultimately do them any good? Temporarily perhaps, but ultimately no. We can see for ourselves. This is not to say that a person does not have needs that must be met. But it's a case of proper perspective. What does a person really need? If they have enough to eat, enough to wear on their back, have a nice place to stay, what more could they want? And yet so many of us are continually involved in wanting more and more that we don't actually need. And it's a case of establishing a proper perspective on what is truly and ultimately meaningful and important. Surely it is a far greater goal to work towards higher states of rebirth and ultimately the release of the mind into the awakened state of Buddhahood. Surely that is a far greater goal than merely trying to consolidate more and more within the single context of this lifetime. In fact, involving ourselves in this spiritual process of development towards higher states of rebirth temporarily and ultimately the goal of Buddhahood, this is perhaps the greatest responsibility, the greatest task that we can undertake within this brief interval between birth and death. During this present bardo or interval state between birth and death, we are not able to engage in a very deep, far-reaching practice of virtue, spiritual practice. Nevertheless, it is possible through the connections that we establish in this lifetime with the Dharma, with the Three Jewels, particularly through the vehicle of tantric empowerment and the introduction to the blessings of these teachings, it is possible that through our faith and connection that when we come to die, there can nevertheless be benefit, even though we may have not been able to carry these teachings through to their ideal consummation. We may die because of an illness, we may die in an accident, we may die simply through growing older and dying naturally. But in any case, the process, regardless of the cause of death, is much the same. Our physical body is constituted of solid matter, such as the flesh and bone, which is representative of the element of earth. Our body also contains fluids, blood and lymph and pus and so forth, which is the element which is representative of the element of water. Our respiration and the various kinds of energy moving in the body are representative of the motility of the element of wind. The biological warmth of our body while we are still alive, while we are animate creatures, is representative of the element of fire. And the ultimate emptiness of our mind and body, lacking any self-nature in and of themselves, is representative of the element of space. And so our mind-body complex, as it is constituted at present, is connected with and is representative of these 5 elements of earth, water, fire, air, and space. The process of dying, the bardo or interval of the process of dying, involves the disintegration of this mind-body complex from grosser or coarser levels to more subtle levels. If we take the example of someone who's dying due to an illness, there may come a point where the illness is termed fatal. There are no longer any cures, any antidotes. There's nothing that can be done for the patient except to wait for them to die. And that person begins slowly but surely to die from that illness. At that point, these 5 elements which constitute the makeup of their mind and body begin to deteriorate. As well, the sense faculties through which that individual perceives the world, through seeing, through hearing, through smelling, through tasting, and through touching the world around them, these begin to deteriorate as well. And there is a process of dissolution whereby the coarser elements dissolve into their more subtle counterparts. The first stage of this dissolution process occurs when the element of earth dissolves into and is absorbed into the element of water, the next most subtle element. And the physical sensations of a dying person experiencing this stage are of great heaviness of body. Their physical body somehow begins to feel enormously heavy. And they find that they can't even lift their head up or move their arms and legs as they could before. They lose motor control over their limbs. And inwardly they experience a great deal of fear and suffering. And because of the dissolution of this earth element, they hear and feel what seems to them to be a great quaking of the earth. It is as though everything that is solid around them is losing its solidity. The next stage involves the dissolution of water into the next most subtle element, that of fire. And similarly, the person experiences on a physical level a dehydration of their body. They begin to lose control over their excretion. And they begin to experience a dryness of the mouth and the nasal passages and so forth as the water element dissolves. And the physical ramification of that is that the body begins to dry up, begins to lose its moisture. Inwardly, they may hear a very terrifying sound as though they were caught up in a huge flood or tempest, as though a large river were sweeping them away. And so on it goes, from grosser to or coarser to more subtle elements, each one with its attendant experiences on a physical and a mental level. As well, the person's sense faculties begin to deteriorate and fade. They begin to lose the ability to see. They can't even recognize someone as close to them as one of their parents or one of their children or their spouse. They can't recognize anyone's voice or make any sense of the sound in the world around them. And they begin to lose touch on all of these sensory levels with the world around them. And this is simply the process of this bardo, this interval state of the process of dying, the disintegration of the mind-body complex. Now, if a person has connection through an empowerment of this kind to the teachings concerning the process of dying and the after-death state, the manifestation of the peaceful and wrathful mandalas of deities, and the nature of the dying and after-death process, then while it is difficult to maintain awareness during the dying process and during the period immediately following death, nevertheless, if one has the predisposition through connection with and study and practice of these teachings, then it is very easy for the mind to be liberated. While it is difficult to bring the mind to bear in the first place, once the mind can be brought to bear on that process, there is enormous potential for the mind to be liberated.
다 냐만바 저르저도 요레스 저르저도 자와 다서 저도 좀 쓰는데 저거 요레 대가텔라 냐만바 쓰는데 저거 요레스 되네 냐만바 다서 저도 좀 쓰는데 되네 그지나셔라 턴도 깔아 요 노아 만다와 쓴 자가 요레스 집배가 용사 쓴데 통거 요레스 배나 냐만바 다서 좀 깔아 되네 다 백개서라 동사가 야래 동 대림보 타유 되네 마망에서 그 기름을 흥수는 하라고 흥도가 예쁜 하라고 저도 또 같은 백가를 되네 더 사승에 와도는 흥도 하라고 또 소면은 흥도인지 받아고 때문에 그거는 백가를 동 나포 가연 통지면 배동을 흥수하라고 다 되라 양아를 용서 쓴 야레스.
At that point, during the final stages of the dissolution process, there are a number of very frightening, terrifying experiences that the mind of the dying individual undergoes. In general, during this lifetime, our mind is influenced by and subject to a great plethora of afflictive emotions. Buddhism speaks of some 84,000 afflictive emotions. But the root of all of these, the fundamental emotions, are those of attachment, aversion, and stupidity, or apathy of mind. And at the point that one has reached or at the point that the dying individual reaches the end of this process, all of this emotional affliction of the mind has come down to these three primary emotions of basic attachment, basic aversion, and basic stupidity, or dullness of mind. And at the point that the consciousness of the individual dissolves into the most subtle level of consciousness, known as the alaya, the universal ground consciousness, there is an experience of these various frightening sounds, although of course the ears cannot hear, but inwardly the mind hears these frightening or terrifying sounds. And there is also a visual experience, which again is not experienced through the eyes, through the visual faculty, but an inward vision or an inward seeing of three abysses, three chasms into which the mind plunges. When the primary emotion of attachment dissolves and is temporarily arrested at this point, there is the experience as though the mind were plunging into a red chasm or abyss. And there is that concomitant feeling of helplessness and terror, as though the individual were actually falling headlong into that abyss. When the next primary emotion, that of anger and aversion, dissolves and is temporarily arrested, there is an experience, a light grayish abyss or expanse, bottomless pit into which the mind seems to be falling. And there is the terror which is inherent in that kind of experience. And finally, when the primary emotion of stupidity dissolves and is arrested at this stage in the dying process, there is the experience as though the mind were falling into a dark or black abyss, completely without any light or illumination, like a deep bottomless hole into which the mind is plunging headlong.
디칼은 후알 샤라메 알라진 후알 샤가야레스 데리 자동 또파 선주 소송과다가 야레스 파스페 드라디슈나 자동로 터야 마레스 데네 소네네 말토페 라타 마포테 용 힐칼 야체 용거야레스 대간 통화를 말랑에 저거야레스 대간 다사고 또 발전처만 가져야레스 되네 그만이 지칼 트레페칼 마시 자다서 저 바텔라 되네 나라면 화차가야레 되레 연 따다 다사고 또 바가페칼 하이퍼다 포마타버스 슈나임 다사고 또 버시아타고 말레스 되네 다틸라 그만이 트레페 바다 마시 자도에 칼라 되네 나타면 저거야레스 대칼라 되네 तबुला चुप तो पद्दे गाने रोज जाचे को न तो तंगाड़ा यारे तेने जमे तो जाल सावरेस.
At the end of this process then, when there has been no means, no intervention possible, and finally the person dies, the process of dying comes to its final conclusion, the breakdown of the psychophysical organism completes itself when the subtle energy that is derived from the mother and father at conception, the subtle biological energy that is centered in the crown of the head and in the genitals, begins to, the duality or the polarity between these begins to break down. And first, the force which is described as the white bindu in the crown of the head, which derives from the male parent, regardless of whether you are male or female, derives from the male parent, this energy begins to move downwards towards the heart, down through the center of the body. And at that point, while the vision is no longer operating properly, there is a field of white or grayish-white illumination that the mind experiences. And with that, there is the final arrest in this lifetime of the 33 different thought patterns based upon anger and aversion. And traditionally it is said that if the mind of an individual at this particular point were presented with the sight of someone murdering their father in front of their eyes, they could feel no anger, they could feel no resentment, they could feel no aversion to that sight, because the mind is simply incapable at that point of experiencing that kind of emotion. Immediately following this, the red energy, which derives from the female parent, the mother, and which is located in the genital region, begins to rise towards the heart. And at that point, the mind is presented with a red field, a uniform red field. Again, not visually through the eyes, but a kind of inner vision. And at that point, the 40 thought patterns based upon desire and attachment are arrested. The mind becomes incapable of experiencing that emotion. Even were the mind of the individual to be presented with the most gorgeous god or goddess, there would be no thought of attachment or attraction in the mind, because it simply cannot function in that way at that point. Finally, when these two energies coalesce at the heart, there is an experience of a uniform black field, dark field. And at this point, just as the consciousness slips into unconsciousness, there is the final arrest of the 7 thought patterns based upon stupidity and dullness of mind. And so, through this threefold process, the 80 different patterns of discursive thought are arrested. The mind loses consciousness and plunges into a state resembling a faint or a swoon, falls into a state of unconsciousness.
Lel hawe jisne karisena pena shaji chingzel bayena drado chen table tene kom purchushu ya na kal prodogres that abaji padul lisuni trarande ya tikal phoi pala tene mada pisina tapa dea chen chiko desi pusu pata batela ten pataga yares.
There are many techniques, many methods of practice which can be of use during the dying process, particularly at the end of the dying process, at the moment at which mind and body separate, when the final bond between these dissolves. And perhaps the most effective, the most powerful of these is the technique known in Tibetan as Poa, the transference of consciousness, whereby through a process of meditation that is practiced and with which one becomes familiar in this lifetime, one can actually facilitate the exit of the consciousness from the body in a skillful and conscious way. And so by a fairly small degree of familiarity and practice in this lifetime, a person can prepare themselves for effective release of the consciousness from the body at the moment of death. It is particularly easy to facilitate this if the person is prepared and conscious at the time, simply because the mind, at the moment that the mind-body complex finally dissolves, the bond between the two finally dissolves, the mind is like a bird that has been freed from a cage and is ready to take off. If you've ever watched a bird that is just poised, ready to fly, you know that the slightest movement, the slightest thing that startles it, sets it off into the air, because it's in a state of total readiness. And in the same way, the mind at that point is in a state of total readiness to be transferred, to be moved to a higher level of consciousness. Ideally, at this point, the mind, through skillful application of the POA technique, the transference of consciousness, can attain to a blissful and pure state of experience, a pure realm, rather than having to go through the otherwise inevitable process of rebirth in samsara.
Tene that teka tela tene chini padamala tene the jaro kala tene rasato shaja chimbo zopa chimbo tene nyala yapayana tene de cheka padok dunga jito te pena la chimbo jikala tema tane deyana tene la tinone matra to bosso to runa las pakon ragena 통가 야레스 대답을 대처와 등하지 처와 지적을 처와 거에 받다지 통화자네 등하기네 용거야 말이지 만용화도 가르치는 나들이 가서도 사두라서 바감에 또 텔레쇼레스 다 제메도 나트메 로이 카텔라 드네 페나 실라 니마 라소나 넘바라소나 드네 노라 바티 세버지 바잖아 용살 속에 저거를 베티노지가 들 산타 만타세 자타스 로한테 매네 리파론사도 지가와 들 다타가서 상에는 가서 라바 노지 살이 또스 순디지 바티고나 로트가 야레스 자치를 나트가 야레스 다자자 드네 지리 바도 두가를 저트가 야레스.
The next stage of the process brings us to the interval, the Bardo or interval state of dharmata, of the fundamental nature of reality. The normal way in which this is usually experienced by an unenlightened being is as a state of unconsciousness. That is to say, the mind finally slips into a state of total darkness, total unconsciousness. If a practitioner has been exposed to and has developed some familiarity with the yoga of luminous clarity of mind, or of the Mahamudra teachings, or the great perfection teachings of the Nyingma school, at this point, the person will experience all of the appearances, all of the perceptions of the process of dying, but without the attendant suffering that an unprepared individual might. It will be rather like sitting in a car or a bus and taking a trip and watching the scenery go by. That is to say, you take note of it as it goes by, but you don't react to it in any emotional way necessarily. It simply passes in front of your eyes and is noted as so doing. And in the same way, a person who has this stability of practice and this insight into the nature of mind will go through the stages of dying, but will not experience the same kind of emotional quality of suffering and pain that an unprepared individual would. And furthermore, at the moment of death, where there is normally this slipping of the mind into unconsciousness, there dawns rather a state of illumination for such a prepared individual, due to their realization of the luminous clarity of mind, due to their experience of Mahamudra or Mahāti. They experience rather what is similar to the turning on of a light when the sun sets. That is to say, when one kind of illumination disappears, you replace it with another kind of illumination, and there is no darkness that ensues. Because as soon as one kind of illumination fades from view, there is another to replace it. And the way in which this takes place is simply that due to the power of their practice, due to the influence of their meditative insight, the inherent luminous clarity of intrinsic awareness dawns at the moment of death. The moment at which the mind would normally plunge into unconsciousness triggers this experience of the inherent luminous clarity. Rinpoche says, as I have described before, the nature of mind is emptiness, is luminous clarity, and is an unimpeded and dynamic manifestation of this emptiness and luminous clarity. And so it is possible for the bardo, the interval state of dharmata, of the fundamental nature of reality, to be experienced not as a state of unconsciousness, but as the dawning of this new kind of illumination, the inherent luminous clarity of mind. Now, this experience of resting one-pointedly in the inherent luminous clarity of mind can last for a period of 3 to 7 days, depending on the given individual concerned, but it culminates in the attainment of awakened Buddhahood. In the Nyingma tradition, the ancient tradition of the Great Perfection teachings, or Mahā'ati teachings, there is often a quote which is referred to in the teachings that through this system, if you meditate in the morning, you attain enlightenment in the morning. If you meditate in the evening, you attain enlightenment in the evening. You even attain enlightenment without meditating. The point is that there's this instantaneous realization. In the Sarma, or new schools of Tibetan Buddhism, through dealing with the Mahamudra approach, there's a similar quote from one of the root texts which states that in a single instant you are completely awakened as a Buddha. In a single instant you understand the difference, that is to say the difference between samsara and nirvana. In either case, regardless of how we choose to describe it, there is the experience of awakened Buddhahood. If a given individual is not able to achieve this release during the bardo, during the interval of dharmata, the fundamental state of reality, fundamental nature of reality, but instead experiences this period of unconsciousness, at a certain point, just before the bardo of becoming, the process of rebirth begins, there is an interval, a brief interval, in which there are the glimmerings of consciousness and discursive awareness arising in the mind again. And the way that this particular process of returning consciousness is experienced by the mind is in terms of the configurations of these mandalas of peaceful and wrathful deities, of the 58 wrathful and 42 peaceful deities of the bardo or intermediate state. There is a spontaneous arising of these forms, these divine forms in these symmetrical configurations, as well as the experience of rays and points of light, which again, there is no eye, normal vision involved, but an inner vision in which the mind experiences these as though they were external projections. Through the process of empowerment into these mandalas of peaceful and wrathful deities and the practice based upon this empowerment, a person in this lifetime can gain the kind of faith and confidence in this experience and awareness of the nature of this experience that when their mind finally is presented with it in the bardo, in the after-death state, rather than experiencing fear and terror at these seeming apparitions, the individual's mind understands or recognizes the divine nature of that experience and simply rests naturally in the inseparability of the mind experiencing the mandalas and the mandalas as projections of the mind. And so this is another opportunity at which it could be particularly easy for the mind to become liberated from the cycle of existence. If on the basis of these projections manifesting as which are manifestations of the intrinsic awareness of the mind, the dynamic and intrinsic awareness of the mind, on the basis of those projections, through recognition, the mind can be released. And so here's another opportunity where these kinds of teachings can prove effective.
다시 촬영 그야레스 데칼라 라라라이 망아시바다 라로세 망아시나 저 터가야레데 그만다고 초이까다고 저렇게 찌찌고 도체 카본다고 야레 가르치나 리파트는 드라마도 빠르다 또 소와니 뭐 저트 그래 도체 칸조아레데 이나요 저 터가야레스.
The first instant of this experience is that of the mandala of 58 wrathful deities. And if the mind of the deceased individual can recognize these deities for what they are, recognize them as nothing more or less than the projections of mind itself, then it is possible for the mind to become liberated in that very instant because of the very dynamic quality of these wrathful deities as the expression of intrinsic awareness. In the very next instant, if the mind does not become liberated, there is the arising of the mandala of the 42 peaceful deities. And again, if the individual can recognize these as the inherently divine projections of his or her own mind, then as before, there can be release. It will be slightly less instantaneous. It won't be as direct or as immediate as in the case of the wrathful deities. Because the peaceful deities are manifestations rather of the emptiness and luminous clarity of mind rather than its dynamic and intelligent awareness. And so there is a subtle difference to be noted here. It is not that it is any less effective in the long run, but that there will be a slight difference in the immediacy. It is far more immediate when the realization takes place during the dawning of the wrathful mandala than during the dawning of the peaceful mandala. But again, the difference is only slight and does not constitute a fundamental difference in terms of the eventual result.
Della così lasciasa gratis della songe che della gendrebola supacoma songe che yatta coe but così desini bolo naga yaris così yasiris della così yasete mari pedune rong shematu tomatu baltene così lascia choris così lascia lascia su gela supacuna della così yasete della songe rong sen songe yimata ngamachi patala tene della trusmaris trabatala tene lachi onge garas tata mali tana yom della nasa chetu yamaris shera garasu lindela jua della tata pumbo nasi su je yeri jela supa della tsuma yaris 대통체 마시타나 대통체 시릴 하소 그런지 예바레스 대가르스나 예세 마시네 예세이나 예세 카로라 예세 코로라 시릴 하소 터체 런지 예세 제명원에 내야레스 되네 다타가르소 인지 첨보 단지 첨보 셈바 첨보 인자 트라츠 카바야레스 이나 다타랑 거나 tene chini bado go kala tene nami ki lido dran do yares te kala tene wa shena de troje la labo kabo mama trot yare te chini bado go dong tene zo da bores ta te jela tene tomato na supa bado chaga yares.
In general, the fact that the mind of a given individual can achieve freedom or release during these interval states of the dying process and the experience immediately following death, the bardo of dharmata, bardo of the fundamental nature of reality, the fact that this is possible is due to the fact that the very nature of our minds, the way our mind actually is in and of itself, which is sometimes described as the Buddha nature, Tathagata Garbha, which is sometimes described as the primordial awareness, which is the basis of all experience. That within that fundamental nature of mind, all of the positive qualities of enlightenment, all of the causes and the results to which they lead in the spiritual path, all of these are complete, are inherent as latent potentials. It is simply the case that this inherent primordial awareness, which is the basis of all enlightened experience, is somehow obscured or distorted. There is a lack of a direct appreciation on our parts of that Buddha nature. And because our mind cannot experience directly its own true nature, there is rather a distortion of this primordial awareness into a discursive consciousness, which is the basis of all unenlightened experience. And from this fundamental state, arising from a lack of direct and inherent awareness, there emerge various avenues of discursive consciousness, which are sometimes referred to collectively as the 8 avenues of discursive consciousness. And these give rise to the whole spectrum of confused appearances which constitute samsara, the cycle of conditioned existence. Even though we have attained a particularly fortunate state of rebirth as human beings within that cycle, we are nevertheless incapable of directly recognizing that nature of mind, except as an intellectual concept. It remains a latent potential. But the very way in which our psychophysical organism is constituted, even within samsara, has a direct analogy to the enlightened state of being. Our body is composed of the 5 elements. Our psychophysical makeup is sometimes described in Buddhism from the point of view of the 5 skandhas, or aggregates. We speak of these 8 avenues of discursive consciousness and their corresponding objects. If we are able to perceive directly, not intellectualize, but to perceive directly and recognize the true nature of all of these different facets of our experience, we experience them as the kinds of energies and the kinds of principles represented by the peaceful and wrathful deities in these mandalas. We might say that the peaceful and wrathful deities, the mandalas of peaceful and wrathful deities, reside inherently within this fundamental stratum of being, which is primordial awareness. Now, during our waking state in this lifetime, we view the world around us with a great deal of fixation upon its solidity and reality, with a great deal of, we focus upon ourselves, our perceived egos, or selves, investing them with a great deal of solidity and reality. And we cling to these perceptions as though they were some kind of ultimate truth. But during the process in which the mind is inevitably divorced from the physical body, this physical body which is a product of previous karma, at that point it is particularly easy for this realization to take place, for the fiction of conventional reality to be seen through, and for the individual to perceive the inherently pure nature of the experience and the inherently pure nature of all the different facets of their ordinary experience. And so all of the impure elements of our experience are directly analogous to these different aspects of pure or enlightened awareness as represented by the peaceful and wrathful deities in these mandalas. However, it may be the case that the individual again misses this opportunity, and the next Bardo state, the next interval through which the mind will pass, is that of the so-called Sipe Bardo, the Bardo of becoming, which is the process of rebirth. Traditionally, this final period of Bardo or interval state, that of becoming, the process of moving towards rebirth in samsara, is held to be 49 days. But this is an approximate figure. It may last as long as 41 days. It may last as short a time as a week or several weeks. But generally speaking, the period of 49 days has been traditionally presented as at least by and large, the maximum time that the mind will spend between, in a disembodied state, between the death in a previous lifetime and the conception or birth into a future lifetime. Now, during this period of time, the mind experiences many different hallucinations and projections. During the earlier part of this interval, these are largely based upon the state of existence immediately preceding the previous lifetime in which the person or being has just died. So if you were an American living in Los Angeles, you would start to have perceptions of being in Los Angeles or being in America, perhaps seeing your family again, or friends, or environments that you were familiar with in this lifetime. All kinds of experiences would arise in your mind as a direct projection of this emotional triad of attachment, aversion, and stupidity arising again in your mind. There would be no external reality to these perceptions. It would be just as though you were recalling experiences from the former lifetime. But towards the latter half of this process, even the appearances of the previous lifetime finish. At that point, the mind is no longer conscious of America or Los Angeles or the parents in the previous lifetime or anything that was familiar in the lifetime before. Any trace or vestige of that experience has been lost. And instead, the mind is rather like a bird's feather being blown around in the wind, completely at random. And the kinds of experiences that come up in the mind are completely random and chaotic. And so there is a complete disorder, a complete lack of coherence to the perceptions and appearances that arise in the mind at this point. If the individual is one who has accumulated a great deal of positive karma through virtuous activity in the previous lifetime, these appearances will be largely of a joyful or pleasant or happy nature. If the person, on the other hand, has committed a great deal of harmful action in the previous lifetime, the negative karmic patterns give rise to many terrifying and painful and unfortunate experiences. But nevertheless, regardless of the nature of the experience, or rather of the content of the experience, the process is such that after a given amount of time, that may be longer or shorter, depending on the given individual, At a certain point, the process comes to an end, and the mind is propelled by karmic forces beyond its control into another state of rebirth, as a human being or as a being in one of the other of the 6 realms of samsara. And so again, we begin this process all over again, of the mind circling through these different states of bardo, of intermediate state.
Bardo della Pemetap, Bardo Jato Trula Supan Pemetap, Zoda Bote, Pena Samanina, then Tony to Nija, Jasachi, Jasote, La Nara Chiru, the Nagachirula Supane, Remarkers, then Jelly, Mana, Tuma, Jelly, Mana, Bardo Vasazone, Bardo Pemetara, Tachi, Remarkers in the Yardage, then Somanina on the Tona. Yo, they know Gila, Je, Tony, Ijela, Tang, last year Tony, the Tang, Top Butter, then that is Je, Zopativo, Chesel, the La Tegal, the Chesela, just enough to take the Dang, Dama, Mazazone, Tomo, Moroto, the trip. Nipa did Trosu to Ja, Java, Chini Ronda Jovate, just enough to take the Mango, Zozo. They jela, the lam tagag jesum de, the chini gasum, no compare, repatsabe, chini seven to my jel ten, the Padawas, so much matches pendatap, the Dracona decade and Yasalakina, the Kotagayades, the Tatagaroso, the Kaya married the Savena, which is in a Savena with the corner, the Shara, Ketchamoto, Pato Chemuri, the Sonino Pajela, the owned the Candere, also get the Canage, organize a Candere, Del Panto Candere, last year, get the Candere, Padel Pamata Candere, reminds us the Cheta Younger, Shara Ketchimbares.
In general, then, this concept of bardo, or intermediate state, is so all-encompassing that one could really regard all of the 84,000 collections of the Buddha's teachings as being subsumed under this concept of bardo. It is that crucial or that important. In particular, people who have taken part in the 3 or 3-month retreat program, or who intend to do so in the future, will be interested to know that this retreat is set up along the lines of presenting in a developmental way to the individual the methods by which one comes to appreciate and begin to work with the 4 or 6 states of bardo, the different interval states that arise in one's life. In the Sarma, or new traditions of Tibetan Buddhism, the ground of the path is held to be the simultaneous union of emptiness and compassion as the inherent nature of being. And the path that is followed employs such techniques as the yogas, the 6 yogas of Naropa and the 6 yogas of Niguma, which are very powerful and effective means for learning to transform these different intermediate states. They are concerned directly with the luminous clarity yoga of the state of deep sleep and the dream yoga of the dream state. The practice of bardo, which is particularly concerned with transformation of the after-death experience and the skillful use of that experience in spiritual development. And all of these are presented in a progressive and developmental way during the period of 3 years and 3 months in this retreat. In the Nyingmapa school, the ancient school of Tibetan Buddhism, again, the ground is recognized as this same union of emptiness and compassion. And the 2 stages of development and completion of tantric practice form the path in this system as well. The particular tenets of the Nyingmapa school involve what is called trekcha on the one hand, which means something like cutting through or cutting through solidity, and tugal, or leaping beyond the peak, going beyond the pinnacle. And the Nyingmapa path is sometimes described as the ground of trekcha, the ground in which the person comes to recognize, through cutting through the solid misconceptions about the nature of reality, comes to recognize the true nature of reality for what it is, and to appreciate the natural freedom of mind within the true nature of that reality, the person then follows the path of Tugal, or passing beyond the pinnacle, leaping beyond the pinnacle, in which there is a fourfold progression of experience. First, the individual technically, these are termed the actualization of dharmata, of the true nature of reality, where this is brought into actual living experience. The second level of Dzogchen, or Great Perfection experience, is termed the enrichment of one's meditation experience. The third is known as the stage at which intrinsic awareness is brought to its fullest measure. And there is finally what is termed the exhaustion of dharmata, where one comes to the very limit of the nature of reality and passes beyond to the ultimate experience. And again, in this kind of system, one is dealing very directly with this concept of Bardo, of these different intervals in our experience, and how to work within those intervals in the most skillful way. Obviously, this kind of approach, even as it is presented in a 3-year and 3-month retreat program, takes a great deal of time which we don't have this evening. All we can do at this point in a short period of time is plant seeds, but that doesn't mean those seeds are wasted. That doesn't mean to say that because it's a short treatment that it's somehow superficial or not meaningful. If a person appreciates what seed has been planted, then the fruit can nevertheless grow from that seed. Over the next few days, there will be some explanation of the nature of the empowerment, of what one is to be focusing upon, meditating upon during the empowerment, of the nature of empowerment in general, what the benefits of empowerment are in general, and this particular empowerment in particular, and how, in a general way, how the stages of development and completion are applied in an individual's practice. And so by paying attention to these seeds as they are planted and by appreciating their significance, a person's understanding comes to grow and grow. Rinpoche says, now, in general, to look at me, you might think, well, here's an old man who isn't up to very much. He doesn't have a lot of energy, and really you can't expect him to carry on for too long. But Rinpoche says, if it's a benefit to anyone, I'll keep talking. I'll talk as long as you want me to. As long as there's benefit for you folks out there, I'll keep talking. We do, however, have to take time into account, and we are running late. Rinpoche said, I had hoped to offer to bestow the vow of refuge this evening for those people who may be wishing to take part in this Vajrayana empowerment tomorrow and have not yet received the formal transmission of refuge. Obviously, it's too late for that tonight. What we will do is make time in the program tomorrow afternoon before the actual empowerment, the preparation for the empowerment begins. So in the early afternoon tomorrow, for those people who wish to receive the vow of refuge, who have not formally done so, you should understand that it is a prerequisite for the empowerment, and you should come tomorrow afternoon, and before the actual empowerment starts in the afternoon, there will be the vow of refuge. To conclude for this evening, then, let us join together in dedicating the roots of virtue, as we would say in the Buddhist tradition, the fundamental virtue that has been established through the explanation and the listening to the explanation of this concept of Bardo, dedicating this virtue so that all sentient beings may eventually be freed from the ocean of suffering, which is samsara, and that they may attain the state, the precious state of awakened enlightenment, which is Buddhahood. So let us join together in a spirit of dedication and aspiration to conclude the gathering.
三龙德尼
啷哲西巴尼，头内尼边张啷旁切尼，切嘎那切巴啷朱巴伊，西边索伦卓瓦卓瓦人修，给瓦德耶修，我跟松那米谢次多德，松那米谢雷中，当巴跟尼多巴人修。Chitra Chamba Dan Kundo Sambo Dayan Dayan Dela Kunji Jesa Dala Kewa Dada Tanjera Do Jewa Kundo Yanda Lama Dan Rame Chichi Pala Longse Je Sada Lamji Yantara Zone Dorje Chongi Kopanya Do Yo Chida Gordo Jela Sele Sale Jalu Je Pache Jene Trashi Soma Chiji Trashi Yo Sato Sada